Welcome to another deep dive on Chesterton Radio. We are broadcasting live today from Atchison, Kansas, home of Benedictine College. And we have an absolutely massive story to unpack for you today.
We really do. It's epic in every sense of the word.
Yeah. So imagine surviving the deadliest outbreak of the bubonic plague in human history. You walk out of a quarantine camp where, tens of thousands of people have just died in sheer agony all around you. You're traumatized, you're starving, you're exhausted.
Completely broken down.
Exactly. And as you stumble through this sort of apocalyptic nightmare, you finally find the man who ruined your life, the untouchable corrupt tyrant who ordered you killed, who stole your fiancée and forced you into exile. But he isn't standing over you with a sword.
No, he's not.
He is lying helpless on a straw mat. His body is convulsing, and he is just minutes away from death. And you have a choice. You can take the revenge you've been dreaming of for 2 years, or you can realize that the only way to save your own soul is to look down at the monster who broke your world and forgive him.
Yep. It is, honestly, the ultimate moral crucible. And it completely upends how we usually think about power and justice.
It really does. So today, our mission for this deep dive is to explore what happens to a moral universe when it is placed under the most extreme stress imaginable. We are looking at Alessandro Manzoni's 19th century masterpiece, The Betrothed, but we're experiencing it through the lens of a classic cinematic radio play adaptation.
Which is such a brilliant way to experience it, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to see how this story tackles systemic corruption, war, famine, and, like we mentioned, a devastating plague. But I think the real hook here, the reason this 19th century Italian novel still matters so much today, is that it frames all of this chaos around a simple love story.
Right. It's ordinary people caught inside massive historical forces.
Yeah. And to really understand what's at stake, we need to talk about the setting. So we are in Lombardy, in Italy, in the year 1628.
And if you're listening to this, you really need to strip away any modern assumptions you might have about, law and order. Because Lombardy in 1628 is a region under foreign occupation.
The Spanish Habsburgs, right?
Exactly. The Spanish hold the territory. So the local government is essentially this puppet regime run by a distant viceroy. But on the ground, power is just completely decentralized and highly lethal.
Yeah, lethal is the right word.
The legal system exists on paper, but it's totally a phantom. Real power belongs to the local nobility, who operate basically like independent warlords.
And they enforce that power using what the story calls bravos. And I want to pause on that term for a second, because when I first heard it in the audio play, I pictured, like generic cartoon henchmen or something.
Sure, like guys in matching outfits.
Yeah. But the historical reality is so much darker than that. These aren't just local street thugs. Europe has been embroiled in constant warfare during this period, so the countryside is flooded with unemployed mercenaries. These are highly trained, deeply traumatized, hyper-violent men who just sell their swords to the highest bidder. They are essentially private, heavily armed mafias.
And they're the physical manifestation of this terrifying reality. If you have wealth and a private army, the law simply does not apply to you. Full stop.
Wow.
That is the environment Manzoni drops us into. And what makes this adaptation so brilliant is how it immediately juxtaposes this massive, terrifying societal decay with a problem that is, frankly, almost frustratingly mundane.
Yes. The inciting incident. It's brilliant because it's so small. Beneath all those grand historical forces, the entire plot kicks off with two completely ordinary people, Renzo and Lucia.
Just peasants.
Yeah, they aren't trying to overthrow the Spanish occupation. They literally just want to get married. And their entire existence is completely derailed by a local nobleman, Don Rodrigo, who decides, out of pure entitlement and lawless passion, that he wants Lucia for himself.
And the mechanism Rodrigo uses to block this marriage introduces us to, one of the most complex characters in literature, the local village priest, Don Abbondio.
Oh man, Don Abbondio.
Right. And the radio play introduces him through sound design before he even speaks. You hear the leisurely, rhythmic crunch of his boots on a dirt path near Lake Como. You hear him softly murmuring his evening prayers.
It's a totally peaceful scene.
Exactly. It's the sonic picture of a man whose entire life is built around avoiding friction.
And then the music just drops out. The crunch of the boots stops. Two armed bravos block his path. And their swords are literally clanking in the audio mix, which is so intimidating.
It really is.
And their message from Don Rodrigo is incredibly simple. Do not marry Renzo and Lucia tomorrow, or you will pay for it with your life.
The psychological autopsy of Don Abbondio in this moment is just devastating to listen to. He doesn't experience righteous indignation, right? He doesn't stand up for the sanctity of the marriage sacrament. He instantly calculates the physics of his own survival.
An earthenware pot metaphor.
Yes, Manzoni uses this famous metaphor. Abbondio views himself as a vessel of fragile earthenware, obliged to journey in company with many vessels of iron.
Meaning the warlords. Right. If an earthenware pot bumps into an iron pot, the earthenware shatters. Don Rodrigo is iron. The young peasant couple, Renzo and Lucia, well, they're earthenware too. And Abbondio realizes he must align with the iron or be destroyed.
Okay, hold on. Let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Because are we really calling him a villain for this?
Yeah.
Honestly, looking at my notes and just listening to the sheer panic in the voice actor's performance, I just see a guy trying not to get murdered.
That's a fair reaction.
Right. Like, if you're listening to this and you're judging Don Abbondio, ask yourself, if a cartel boss told you to skip a meeting at work tomorrow or lose your life, wouldn't you fold?
Most people would.
He's like the ultimate terrified middle manager. He has a ruthless CEO above him threatening his life, and frontline workers below him relying on him to process their paperwork. I really struggle to condemn him as purely evil when his cowardice seems like a highly relatable human survival instinct in a totally lawless society.
See, I wouldn't call him evil in the active, malicious sense. But this brings up a critical Chestertonian theme, the difference between survival and moral complicity. Chesterton often pointed out that the coward moves history just as much as the hero does.
Oh, that's a great point.
Let's look at the underlying mechanism of how systemic corruption actually functions. Systems of oppression don't just rely on the active cruelty of the iron pots, the Don Rodrigos. They rely absolutely on the rationalized cowardice of the earthenware pots.
So you're saying the system needs people like Abbondio to work.
Exactly. And the true psychological damage of Abbondio's cowardice reveals itself in what he does after the Bravos leave. As he hurries home, he doesn't direct his anger at Don Rodrigo. He directs his anger at the victim.
Oh, yeah. He starts muttering to himself, complaining about young people who fall in love and create trouble for everyone else.
Right.
He essentially blames Renzo and Lucia for existing because their love is inconvenient to his safety.
And by turning the victims into the perpetrators in his own mind, he protects his ego. He doesn't have to admit he's a weak man bowing to tyranny. He convinces himself he's just a victim of these nuisance-making peasants. That psychological flip is how ordinary, non-violent people become the mortar that holds a corrupt system together.
Man, that is dark. And his survival strategy immediately pivots to bureaucratic gaslighting. He gets back to his parish house, terrified. His servant, Perpetua, who ironically gives the boldest advice, she tells him he should go to the Archbishop, Cardinal Borromeo, who is known for standing up to tyrants.
But Abbondio rejects the legitimate legal and spiritual channels.
Because he believes the physical blade of the corrupt elite is faster than the moral arc of justice. So he decides to use theology as a weapon of delay.
This is such a fascinating historical detail in the story. Abbondio remembers that Lent is approaching in just a few days, and we really need to understand the cultural and theological weight of Lent in 17th century Catholic Lombardy.
It wasn't just giving up chocolate.
Not at all. It was a deeply enforced penitential season. The church strictly prohibited the celebration of joyous sacraments, particularly weddings, during these 40 days. Abbondio realizes that if he can just stall Renzo with administrative nonsense until Lent begins, the calendar itself will legally block the marriage for nearly 2 months.
It just buys him time.
Exactly.
It's the classic stall tactic.
Yeah.
So the next morning, Renzo shows up, dressed in his wedding best, and Abbondio goes into full deflection mode. And I gotta say, the voice acting here is spectacular.
It's so good.
The priest is stammering. He's using complex Latin phrases just to confuse the peasant, claiming there are all these impediments and administrative hurdles. But Renzo isn't an idiot. He senses the evasion right away.
Renzo is impulsive, but he's honest and he's sharp.
Yeah. He leaves the priest deeply suspicious, and he manages to corner Perpetua, the servant, who accidentally lets slip that a powerful tyrant is behind the delay. So Renzo forces the full truth out of her waiting. Don Rodrigo has forbidden the wedding out of lust for Lucia.
And the revelation of that truth shatters the illusion of peace in the village. It forces the peasant couple into desperately divergent reactions, and this is where Manzoni lays out 3 distinct approaches to corrupt power.
Okay, let's break those down.
Renzo represents the first approach. The moment he learns the truth, the audio design underscores his reaction with this low, thrumming bass. His reaction is raw, impulsive human justice, which, in a society with no functioning courts, inevitably means violence.
He declares he will murder Don Rodrigo.
Right.
Which, makes complete, terrifying sense. When the institutions built to protect you, like the church, represented by Abbondio, when they side with your oppressor out of cowardice, asymmetric warfare feels like the only logical recourse.
That's the only math that works in his head.
Exactly. Renzo is a poor man with no guards. Rodrigo is in a fortress. Assassination is the only option Renzo can see. But then we get the second approach, which comes from Lucia.
Right. Lucia is weeping on what was supposed to be her wedding day, but she completely rejects Renzo's turn to violence. She represents passive, enduring faith. She has this quiet strength. She tells Renzo, God is on the side of the poor. How can we expect him to help us if we do wrong ourselves?
Wow.
She deeply believes that adopting the tyrant's methods murder will strip them of their moral high ground and their spiritual protection. She insists they must just flee.
I understand her theology, I really do. But from a practical standpoint, flight is incredibly passive. It just removes them from the immediate blast radius. It doesn't actually stop Don Rodrigo from being a predator.
True.
Because neither violence nor fleeing solves the root problem. They turn to a third character for help, introducing the third approach to power, Father Christopher.
Fra Cristoforo. He is a Capuchin monk, and he serves as the direct moral foil to Don Abbondio.
Total opposites.
Completely. The Capuchins were a reform branch of the Franciscans, dedicated to extreme poverty and serving the absolute lowest echelons of society. They went barefoot, they wore rough habits, and they owned absolutely nothing.
And while Abbondio used his clerical collar to hide from danger, Father Christopher uses his to step directly into the line of fire.
Yes.
He decides to walk straight into Don Rodrigo's fortress for an unarmed, moral confrontation. And the soundscape of this confrontation in the radio play is chilling. You hear the heavy, echoing doors of Rodrigo's palace.
Yeah.
You hear the clinking of wine glasses and the laughter of corrupt politicians and armed guards in the background.
The belly of the beast.
Father Christopher is completely surrounded by the machinery of violence.
That's so.
And Rodrigo is just dripping with condescension. He calls him a drawl friar and mocks his presence, expecting the monk to cower, just like the village priest did.
But Father Christopher bypasses Rodrigo's physical dominance entirely by utilizing spiritual authority. The socioeconomic dynamics here are vital to understand.
Yeah.
Why did the fragile priest, Don Abbondio, fold so easily?
Because he had stuff to lose.
Exactly. He had a comfortable house, a respectable social standing, and a desire for a peaceful life. His attachments made him vulnerable. Father Christopher, having taken vows of absolute poverty, possesses nothing earthly to lose.
Right.
This total detachment creates a profound paradox of power. Because the world can take nothing from him, the world has no leverage over him.
That is such a crucial mechanism to understand.
Yeah.
You can't threaten a man who isn't afraid of dying and has literally nothing to steal. It completely short-circuits Rodrigo's operating system.
It does.
Rodrigo threatens him, and the friar's voice actor drops to this chilling, unwavering whisper. He points at the nobleman and prophesies, "A curse is suspended above you." He compares Rodrigo to Pharaoh, warning that God knows how to break hardened hearts.
And for a brief, agonizing moment, Rodrigo is terrified. The monk speaks to him not just as an equal, but as a moral superior, rendering all those armed guards in the room completely irrelevant.
It's that Chestertonian paradox again. The weakest people carry the greatest dignity.
Absolutely. However, while Christopher wins the moral victory in the room, he fails to change Rodrigo's heart. In fact, the confrontation accelerates the danger.
Right. Rodrigo gets bad.
Rodrigo's bruised ego cannot handle being bested by a penniless friar in front of his guests. He escalates, reaching out to the criminal underworld to crush them definitively.
Realizing the danger has multiplied, Father Christopher orchestrates a midnight escape. Lucia is smuggled away to a distant convent to seek sanctuary, while Renzo must flee toward the city of Milan. The lovers are forced apart.
A heartbreaking separation.
And this is where the narrative scope widens dramatically. Because Don Rodrigo realizes Lucia has slipped through his fingers, he petitions a man who operates above the law, above the viceroy, above everything, a warlord known in the lore as the Unnamed, or Count Ravola.
Count Ravola is a figure of almost mythic terror in this story. He is a nobleman whose entire existence is secured by the force of crime. He lives in an impregnable castle on a cliff. But his psychological profile is what makes him so fascinating. The narrative explicitly states his core drive to do what was forbidden was with him a passion.
Let's unpack that, because throwing around modern terms like psychopath doesn't really quite cover it. He seems to have a severe dark triad personality, specifically the Machiavellianism and the psychopathy, but it's more than just a lack of empathy, right?
Precisely. It's a psychological addiction to transgression. In a highly stratified, rules-bound society like 17th century Europe, power was often defined by what rules you were allowed to break.
Oh, interesting.
For Evola, breaking the law isn't a means to an end, it is the end itself. It is how he affirms his existence. When Don Rodrigo asks him to violate the sacred sanctuary of a convent to kidnap a peasant girl, Rovola agrees not for money, but because the sheer audacity and sinfulness of the act appeals to his compulsion to be the ultimate transgressor.
So Rovola dispatches his top assassin, a man named Nibbio, to snatch Lucia from the convent. And through deceit and violence, Nibbio succeeds. He throws the terrified, weeping Lucia into a carriage and transports her to Rovola's fortress.
Such a grim scene.
It is. But this sets up a scene that, for my money, features some of the best dialogue in the entire radio adaptation. Nibbio goes to report his success to the Count, but something is wrong with the assassin. He hesitates. He admits to the Count that he would rather have shot the girl in the back without looking at her face.
And when Rovola demands to know why, Nibbio, this hardened killer who casually states he has never kept a reckoning of his murders, admits he feels compassion.
Wow.
And the way he describes this compassion is deeply unsettling. He doesn't describe it as a warm moral awakening. He describes it as a paralyzing existential threat. He says, it is something like fear. Once it takes possession of you, you are no longer a man.
I was trying to find an analogy for how this works in the story because it's so counterintuitive. It's almost like an autoimmune response. Nibbio has spent his entire life building this impenetrable psychological armor of apathy and violence just to survive his own career.
Right.
But witnessing the pure, defenseless weeping of this innocent girl acts like a psychological allergen. It causes his own defense mechanisms to suddenly attack his sense of identity. He didn't choose to feel empathy. It infected him.
Infected him, exactly.
It proves that in Manzoni's universe, goodness and innocence aren't just passive traits. They are aggressive, disruptive forces that can literally break the internal machinery of violent men.
That autoimmune analogy is spot on. Compassion dismantles the false, hyper-dominant identity Nibbio has constructed. And consider Count Rovola's reaction. In a lesser story, the warlord would just execute his henchman for showing weakness.
Right, you have failed me. And then he shoots him.
Exactly. But Rovola doesn't get angry. He gets unsettled. The audio play gives us this long, tense silence. Then Rovola says, you become very interesting. You excite my curiosity.
He's genuinely spooked. If his best, most soulless killer can be broken by a crying peasant, Rovola realizes he has to see this girl for himself. He walks down to the tower cell where Lucia is being held. And this begins one of the most famous sequences in Italian literature, The Dark Night of the Soul.
Rovola enters the cell, and Lucia is curled on the floor, paralyzed by terror. He tries to assure her he won't harm her, but she is desperate. In her panic, she offers him a profound theological bargain. She begs him to release her and says, God pardons so many sins for one deed of mercy.
God pardons so many sins for one deed of mercy. It's a single sentence, but it hits Rovola like a physical blow. He leaves her cell, retreats to his chamber, and he utterly collapses psychologically. He spends the entire night pacing. He reviews his life, tracing his history from bloodshed to bloodshed, realizing he is a monster.
The psychology of guilt and isolation here is masterfully rendered. Rovola possesses total worldly autonomy. He answers to no law, yet pacing in his room, he realizes he is agonizingly miserable.
His power didn't bring him peace.
No, it has constructed a hellish internal prison. He is surrounded by sycophants and assassins, but he has no genuine human connection.
Okay, I have to push back here. I really struggled to buy this while listening. A warlord who has spent decades murdering people and ruling through terror suddenly has a massive existential crisis and converts overnight because one captive girl cries and gives him a one-liner about mercy.
It seems sudden, yeah.
It feels like a massive plot contrivance. It feels too clean.
I completely understand that skepticism, but you have to view it through the lens of psychological exhaustion. It's not just that she cried, it's that she held up a mirror to a void he had been ignoring for decades.
Okay, I'm tracking.
Men who live by extreme violence often maintain their sanity through extreme compartmentalization. Lucia's unmerited offer of grace, suggesting that his soul still has value, that he is still capable of an act of mercy that God would actually recognize, shatters that compartmentalization.
Because he never thought he was redeemable.
Right. It is the first genuine, transactional, free human exchange he has experienced in his adult life. The sudden contrast between her pure innocence and his accumulated atrocities creates a cognitive dissonance so massive it breaks his psyche.
Okay, that makes sense. Meanwhile, while he is having this breakdown, Lucia is up in her cell, convinced she's going to be handed over to Don Rodrigo in the morning. She is praying frantically to the Virgin Mary, and during this panic, she makes a desperate vow.
A very fateful vow.
Yes, she promises that if she survives the night, she will remain a virgin forever and renounce her marriage to Renzo. We will absolutely come back to the mechanics of that vow later, because it creates a massive roadblock, but for now, she's just trying to survive the night.
Then dawn breaks. The audio design shifts from the oppressive silence of the castle to the distant, joyful chiming of church bells. Rivola looks out his window and sees throngs of villagers hurrying toward the local parish. He demands to know what is happening, and his guards tell him that Cardinal Borromeo, the Archbishop of Milan, is visiting.
And Rivola is struck by this intense jealousy. He sees these ordinary people who are genuinely ecstatic just to be near this cardinal. Rivola realizes his own name only causes people to flee in terror.
He wants what the cardinal has.
Yeah, he is so desperate for the peace he assumes the cardinal possesses that the most wanted outlaw in the region decides, impulsively, to leave his fortress and walk unarmed into the village.
The tension when he arrives at the curate's house is palpable. The local priests are having a collective panic attack. They tell the cardinal that a mass murderer is at the door, but Cardinal Borromeo's reaction upends the entire social order. He doesn't call for guards. He doesn't recoil. He just says, let him be admitted. He has already waited too long.
The scene between the two men is incredible. Rivola walks in, this terrifying, towering figure, and he is spiritually shattered. He admits he has hell in his heart. And the cardinal physically embraces him.
An amazing moment.
Cardinal tells him that God is using his infamy to glorify divine mercy. He tells Rivola that when a man of his monstrous reputation rises up to condemn his own past, God is uniquely glorified.
It is the ultimate expression of radical grace. The cardinal essentially drafts Rivola into the service of good, telling him he must use his immense agency to repair the wrongs he has committed. And the immediate real-world proof of this internal conversion is that Rivola confesses to kidnapping Lucia and dispatches his men to free her immediately.
Think about the sheer scale of the irony here. The inciting incident of this entire epic was a powerful nobleman, Don Rodrigo, flexing his muscle to crush a tireless peasant girl. And yet that same peasant girl, armed with nothing but her tears and her faith, manages to mentally break and completely convert most terrifying warlord in the country.
The weakest character wields the most transformative power. It's a deeply Chestertonian idea.
Exactly. But, and this is where the narrative pivots from the micro to the macro, while Lucia's immediate physical danger is resolved, the world outside that castle is plunging into apocalyptic chaos. The forces of history that we discussed at the beginning are about to physically tear the lovers apart all over again.
Oh, the radio play executes a massive time jump here. We fast forward 20 months, and we need to explain why the world suddenly falls apart. It's not just bad luck. It's a cascade of historical mechanisms. First, the War of the Mantuan Succession brings German troops, the Landsknechts, marching through Lombardy.
And 17th century armies didn't have modern supply chains.
No, they lived off the land, which meant they stripped the countryside bare, pillaging crops and livestock. This artificially induced a massive famine. Bread prices skyrocketed, leading to the infamous bread riots in Milan, which Renzo actually gets caught up in during his exile.
But the famine and the war are just the warm-up acts, because those German mercenaries brought something much worse with them, the bubonic plague. And this isn't a localized outbreak. This is a societal collapse.
The narrative tracks Renzo's experience of this collapse. He catches the plague, but due to a strong constitution, he survives it. Once he's immune, he navigates this unrecognizable world to find Lucia. He returns to his home village, which is now a ghost town. And there's a moment of dark comedy that reveals so much about human nature. He runs into the village priest, Don Abbondio.
Yes. Oh my gosh. After everything, the war, the famine, a plague that has wiped out half the continent of Abbondio hasn't changed at all.
Not one bit.
Renzo asks him what happened to Don Rodrigo, and Abbondio is still sputtering, looking over his shoulder, terrified of getting in trouble. He tells Renzo to leave before anyone sees them talking, saying, "You would ruin yourself and me too." The man survived the apocalypse, and he's still acting like a terrified middle manager trying to avoid HR.
It demonstrates how cowardice, when practiced long enough, calcifies the soul, becomes an unbreakable reflex. But Renzo manages to discover from a traumatized survivor that Lucia was last seen in Milan. And this requires a staggering display of grit from Renzo. He just walked away from the deadliest disease on earth in Milan. And his immediate response is to turn around and walk right back into the epicenter of the death zone to find her.
He heads to Milan and is directed to the lazaretto. And if you're listening to this, you really need to vividly picture what the lazaretto was. It wasn't a hospital. It was a massive walled quadrangle outside the city, originally built to hold a few thousand people. During the peak of the plague, it was crammed with upwards of 16,000 dead and dying souls.
The audio design of the lazaretto sequence is haunting. The narrator describes it as the swell of the sea, a relentless, churning cacophony of groans, frantic prayers, and agonizing screams. People are convulsing on bare straw. The air is thick with contagion.
It's hell on earth.
And Renzo is wandering through this unimaginable horror, staring into the faces of thousands of dying women looking for Lucia.
This setting serves as a massive narrative equalizer. Think about the power dynamics in the beginning of the story. Don Rodrigo had wealth, bravos, political immunity, and a fortress. But against a microscopic bacterium, none of that infrastructure matters.
The plague doesn't care if you are an iron pot or an earthenware pot. It destroys both.
We see this play out exactly in Don Rodrigo's arc. While in Milan, Rodrigo wakes up after a night of drinking with a burning fever. He looks down and sees the telltale livid purple bubo on his side. He knows he has the plague, and his immediate reaction is a desperate attempt to maintain his aristocratic privilege.
He refuses to be thrown into the lazaretto with the commoners he despises.
So he calls his most trusted bodyguard, an outlaw named Griso. He offers Griso a massive bribe to keep his sickness a secret and fetch a private doctor. But Rodrigo fails to realize that the mercenary culture he created is a snake that eats its own tail. He taught Griso that loyalty is a commodity and power is the only truth.
When Griso sees his master weakened and dying, the mercenary logic dictates his next move. He doesn't help Rodrigo. He mocks him. Griso immediately breaks open Rodrigo's strongbox and starts stealing his gold. When Rodrigo begs for a drop of water, Griso refuses, calling it a waste of time. He then alerts the corpse bearers to drag Rodrigo off to the lazaretto, abandoning him to die among the masses.
The system of corruption cannibalizes itself. Which brings us to the moment we opened the show with, the true climax of the epic. Renzo is searching the lazaretto, and he stumbles upon Father Christopher. The monk is frail, clearly dying of the plague himself, but he is still ministering to the sick.
Renzo is pushed to the absolute edge of his sanity. He tells the friar that if he searches this camp and finds that Lucia is dead, he is going to hunt down Don Rodrigo. Renzo's dialogue is dripping with wrath. He says, "He that chastises, he that scourges, I would be the judge." He is reverting entirely to that first approach to power, raw, vengeful violence.
And Father Christopher shuts him down with a terrifying intensity. The audio play gives the friar this sudden booming authority, and he reveals a shocking secret about his own past. He asks Renzo, "Know you why I am a Capuchin monk? Because I too hated, and that man whom I so long hated, I murdered."
It's a stunning twist. This paragon of moral courage only became a monk because, 30 years ago, he was exactly like Renzo. He hated a tyrant, justified his violence as justice, and committed murder.
Wow.
He knows from intimate experience that vengeance does not balance the scales. It merely transfers the spiritual poison of the oppressor into the soul of the victim.
Christopher warns Renzo that if he chooses hate, he will be lost forever. But the friar doesn't just preach a theological concept, he forces a practical choice. He takes Renzo by the hand and leads him to a miserable, squalid hut inside the quarantine camp. And there, lying on a straw mat, convulsing and completely helpless, is Don Rodrigo.
The very man who blocked the wedding, who ordered the bravos, who caused Lucia to be kidnapped, and who forced them into this hellscape. Renzo could end him with a single blow. No one in the lazaretto would care or even notice.
But Christopher forces Renzo to look at the monster. He tells Renzo, "Bless him and be blessed, God forgive him." And we hear Renzo's ragged breathing. The silence stretches. And then the wrath leaves him. He looks at this pathetic, broken man, and he pities him. He chooses to forgive Don Rodrigo from the bottom of his heart.
This internal choice is the true victory of the novel. Griso, the mercenary, defeated Rodrigo on a physical and financial level. But the spiritual victory required Renzo to break the cycle of violence entirely. By forgiving his oppressor, Renzo reclaims his own humanity and refuses to let Rodrigo's evil turn him into a murderer.
And having passed that ultimate test, the narrative rewards him. Renzo resumes his search, and against all odds, he finds Lucia. She has survived the plague and is working in the women's section of the lazaretto, nursing the sick. It should be the perfect reunion. But because this is a 17th century Italian epic, there is one final massive roadblock.
She refuses to marry him.
Yes. We have to circle back to the dark night of the soul in Calravola's fortress. When Lucia was held captive, terrified of being handed to Rodrigo, she made a vow to the Virgin Mary. She promised that if she was saved, she would remain a virgin forever. She offered her future with Renzo as a theological bargaining chip for her life.
And because she is a woman of profound faith, she believes that contract is completely unbreakable. Renzo is devastated. He tries to argue the semantics. He says, let's promise the Madonna that our first daughter will be named Maria. That honors the Madonna and doesn't hurt us.
Which is honestly an incredibly quick-witted negotiation tactic from a peasant who just survived the plague.
It really is.
But Lucia won't budge.
Fortunately, Renzo knows exactly who to call. He runs back through the camp and brings the dying father, Christopher, to Lucia. And this is where Manzoni uses the specific theology of the Catholic Church to beautifully resolve the plot.
Father Christopher listens to the vow. He doesn't dismiss her faith, but he acts almost like a benevolent spiritual Supreme Court justice reviewing an unfair contract. He recognizes she was under extreme duress, held hostage by an assassin, and he points out a fatal flaw in her collateral. He asks her, did you not recollect at the time that you were already bound by another promise?
He explains that God accepts sacrifices made of our own free will and of our own possessions. But, he tells her, you could not offer him the heart of another also, to whom you had already pledged yourself. She had already promised herself to Renzo. She couldn't give away something that no longer belonged solely to her.
It's such an elegant, logical loophole. And because Father Christopher is an ordained minister, he explicitly uses the structural authority of the Church to strike down the vow. He formally absolves her, returning her plighted word to her. It honors her devotion while restoring the moral order that the villains had disrupted.
The lovers say a heartbreaking goodbye to the friar, knowing he will soon die of the plague, and they leave the lazaretto together. Which brings us to the epilogue of this massive journey.
The plague burns itself out. The warring armies move on, and Renzo and Lucia return to their village. And here is the perfect, ironic punchline to the entire epic. They go back to the parish, and the priest who finally officially marries them is Don Abbondio.
It's so funny.
The exact same terrified middle manager who refused them at the beginning. Because Don Rodrigo died in the plague, the iron pot is gone, and Abbondio suddenly finds the courage to do his job.
It is a brilliantly comic full-circle moment. Following the wedding, they wisely decide to move to a new region to avoid the lingering trauma of their past. They rebuild their lives, they prosper, and true to Renzo's frantic bargaining in the lazaretto, their first child is a little girl whom they name Maria.
Wow. If you take a step back and look at the scope of what we just covered, it is breathtaking. We started with a petty, bureaucratic dispute over a wedding license on a dirt road. We traveled through the psychological torture chambers of dark triad warlords. We survived the geopolitical collapse of a region through war and famine. We walked through the apocalyptic nightmare of a plague camp. And we ended with the quiet, triumphant founding of a single family.
Manzoni gives us a master narrative about endurance and the scale of human morality. The world appears chaotic, but it is secretly ordered by Providence.
Exactly. And broadcasting from here in Atchison, looking at a place like Benedictine College, it really makes you think about the role of faith and ordinary lives lived in small towns. It is very easy to look at the world right now and feel like we're living in 1628. We are constantly surrounded by news of untouchable, corrupt elites. We feel trapped by massive, terrifying historical forces, pandemics, economic crashes, wars that seem to dictate our every move. But The Betrothed offers a radical perspective.
The loud forces of history, the warlords, the bravos, the plagues, are incredibly destructive, but they are ultimately temporary. Evil is loud, but good is persistent. They burn themselves out, they consume themselves, just as Griso consumed Don Rodrigo.
Right. What actually endures, what actually rebuilds society after the apocalypse has passed, are the quiet, persistent, seemingly insignificant choices of ordinary people. The choice to reject vengeance and offer mercy. the choice to keep a promise, the choice to plant a field, to marry, to name a child. When we look back at history, it's easy to just see the storm systems. But down on the ground, beneath the wreckage, it is the ordinary people who are doing the actual work of constructing the future.
Beautifully said.
So as you navigate your own chaotic world this week, I encourage you to look for where that quiet, persistent good is operating around you. Because in the end, that is the only force that survives. We want to invite you to listen daily. Visit chestertonradio.substack.com and tune into the live stream at live.chestertonradio.com. Classic radio, great books, timeless stories.